Good evening and most welcome to age 789. We are presently in Vårgårda and we just gained a new place. It looks brilliant, I could say. It's large, it has a fantastic whiteboard, undisturbed. I'd say everything needed to have a nice start of the week. Actually, we already started. It's only Sunday, what used to be former the first day of the week. And this is going to be a lenient start. I'm going to take it easy. I'm a bit, as one say in Swedish, ringrostig. I haven't done anything in front of anyone for, 10 days, I think, something like that, or quite a while. But today I will talk about, by suggestion of my colleague, the sacred and the commercial. And I will look at it from a deconstructive way and see what possibly could we use deconstruction in this, relation. Could that be used, and what would it then say or point to, if anything? I thought it was quite interesting. Let's have a look, see. This is a subject that has been sort of put a spell on people for a very long time. So it's not completely unspoken before, but it is, however, riddled by different obstacles. And I think that is something, oddly enough, Kalle will find out while reading the Spectres of Marx, because Karl Marx is one of those people who actually try to penetrate the difference between, well, I wouldn't say sacred, but maybe something like just, something like that, just, fair, such stuff. And what is commercial or greed or forces. In the end it becomes forces. But let me just make a very short recap. What is this deconstruction? First we need to take a look at how anything gets established as being, let us call it, focused on or prioritized. We start by making a divide somewhere. We part something and put a dividing line. I use a sphere here, a circle. So these two used to be a whole. They get divided. And then you point to one, almost like a magician. You point to one. You remember a magician, he does card tricks, and what he does, he puts your attention to something while doing something outside of the attention. It's about 90% of card tricks are actually made that way. All sorts of tricks are actually usually something in that vicinity. The magician is not excellent at performing magic. The magic he performs is putting your attention to something. And by putting your attention to something, other things sort of goes into the shadow. And this is called marginalization. So first you take something and you prioritize that. You make that grand. You say this is more important. Just like the magician says, look here. Don't look over here. Look here. Look at this card or whatever it might be. But the other part, just as the magician, he takes his other hand away, he leads the attention of the audience to the important hand, and thereby creating some sort of polarization, one could call it. A division between something from the beginning being whole is now being divided. And the thing that goes into the shadow when it comes to the magician, this is what usually is called marginalized or marginalization as a function verb. So this could also apply for the sacred and the commercial. If you take something that is reality and then you divide that, you create a division somewhere, and you say one thing, this one is sacred, this is nice, this is the better half, this is the thing that the magician is pointing to, the card that magicians want you to look at. Don't look at the other card, just look here. And it actually goes really well with how attention is working, our attention. Because usually if we get interested in something, all the rest of the world sort of slips into the shadows, it disappears, becomes softer, toned out, blurred, not really present. And that's another important trait, because the prioritized thing is not only prioritized, it's more present. The other thing is not present. It's outside of presence. So think of attention that it is something that makes things come into presence. And those things that don't come into presence are being not really there, being not present. This is similar, I think. It's not exactly the same thing as we discussed before in different contexts, explicit, implicit. We also mentioned alatheia and theia. But there are some similarities, but it's not exactly the same. Here, in this context, or in today's lecture, it is the mundane that is castigated. This goes into the shadows. It disappears from our attention. And why is this done? Well, one reason is that you want to really put attention to something. Or it could also be, as in the case of the magician, it's an important part of what's happening. Some things needs to be defined. Because attention is also definition, something that makes it possible for that thing to come into existence in a way. And how is this done? Well, partly actually, the thing that's not present, it's also the defining agent. What is negative? And I use negative in a specific sense. Negative here means what is not talked about, the thing that is in the shadow. For instance, if you have some sort of ambigram, I'm not going to do ambigram, I'm just going to do like this is the negative, and this is what you want to look at. This is what you create when you look at it. This is your creative things. And we previously mentioned this really weird thing that the Swiss or Austrian researcher Necker discovered so many years ago. When he looked into a microscope and he saw crystal, and then he took his eye away from the crystal in the microscope, and he returned, and all of a sudden he saw that the crystal had completely changed. I said, that was odd. There's nothing wrong with this microscope. How come I don't have the same crystal anymore in the microscope, in the focus? So he did that several times, and he even asked other people to do the same thing, to have a look-see, and they all experienced the same thing. The crystal changed its structure. And Necker came to name this Necker cube. That is so amazing, because it can actually change character. It could be different things. And with the crystal it's even more amazing because it's no longer the same crystal. It does changes in front of your eyes. And this is partly what's happening here as well. By prioritizing the good thing, you start sort of carving something out. And you use the other stuff to carve it out. Because as you see here, without a negative space, this wouldn't be either. If I take away the negative space, in the end, you don't have any distinctions at all. So what's around is not talked about. It doesn't seem to be important. It doesn't seem to have a job to do. So, this is how we usually perceive space. It's jobless, it's unemployed. That was a good word. Well, that is not exactly true. It seems that without having something mundane and being of the commercial, being of our needs, being of money, it'd be very hard in this case to tell us what is sacred, because sacred doesn't seem to be able to define itself here. It needs the help of what is bad, and in the end it's almost parasitic from the point of mundane, because we need that. We get dependent on the mundane to tell us what is sacred. And as it is the case with the Necker cube or the Necker crystal, which I prefer sometimes to call, because Necker crystal is even something that you can put in a drink or make some chemicals with. It's even more tangible. It's not a trick of the eye. It's very important to understand. It's not a trick of the eye. This is actually happening. And the two crystals do not have the same properties. They work differently in the world. And this is of course the same thing with the Necker cube. I found Necker cube loads of books that says optical illusions, which is completely crazy. It's very amusing. It's not an optical illusion. It's really happening. It's something absolutely real. And then we start questioning our own vision. No, there is no need, because we are actually doing these things already. We are using what is around to tell us what something is. And there are some benefits of doing that. We get the definition. But there are also prices to be paid. And that price, I would say, in the parasitic tendency of the marginalized thing. It's almost like having slaves. If you're maybe a big slave owner in the Roman times, what happens sometimes, especially if you got too many slaves and you defined yourself according to the slaves, you didn't do much yourself, you only had slaves. What often happened was that the slaves would revolt, because they were actually doing the real work, and they know it. So people already in Roman times spoke about some sort of equilibrium, and this equilibrium was important. Otherwise, the slaves would turn the table, because this can always be turned. The sacred is very dependent on the mundane. It needs it. If it wasn't for the mundane, we wouldn't have any sacred. And you see, that is actually something that weakens something. It's defined by what it's not. That's problematic. Let me give you an example here. This is something that is very typical for the Abrahamic religions. I just got a few texts, and I thought from the beginning maybe it's pilgrimage only when it comes to the Christian tradition. But thinking a bit closer, I thought maybe it's all the Abrahamic religions, something like that. But all of them, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, there is sort of this thing happening all the time. You can remember this famous passage in the Bible where Jesus throws out the vendors, the merchants from the temple in Jerusalem because they were infecting the sacred by their commerce, selling things in the place that was supposed to be the most holy of everything. And it's not good things, one understands. And I remember being very little, hearing this from my teacher, my religious teacher in the church. And I understood somehow that valued goods, money, gold, silver, jewelry, maybe expensive cloth, like silk and wool, those things, maybe they are part of something that is bad somehow. And I also realized somewhere there they were needed to show what was better, the higher level. And that went hand in hand with something I had heard later, maybe a couple of months. And that was once more this tendency. But now it was coming from the mundane to the sacred. And by using this function, one can also say that poverty could be a good thing, because poverty is not the thing we dislike, it's not the mundane. And you can also make a contradiction from the mundane, from the life of need and greed, maybe even, to make a negative term to make it clearer. Let's get away from greed and need. Let's get away also, I'd say, from the body, because it's usually the body. The meat is weaker. And there is a famous line where Jesus says it's harder for a rich man to enter the eye of the needle than it is for it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven, to be heightened, than it is for a camel to enter the eye of the needle. And I think by then this turntable has been fairly established, and now this is a working function. And once you have this division, and you have something that's prioritized and you have something that is marginalized, you have some sort of motion in the text, and a motion that is dependent on there being an opposite. And this actually struck me when I prepared this. This is very close to magnetism. You know, if you have a magnet and if you cut it in half, what will happen? If you cut it right over at the South Pole and the North Pole, what will happen? Will the South Pole disappear or the North Pole? No. At the same instant you cut it, you will have a new North Pole and a new South Pole. And every time you divide the magnet in two, that will happen. And the same will happen to the Earth. If you divide the whole Earth into two parts, you will immediately have a magnetic South Pole and a magnetic North Pole. That will happen within an instant. It will not take even a short while. The same thing is happening here. Every time you divide, because you made something that you want to prioritize dependent on something that you want to castigate. And by doing so, there's also a weakening of the whole tendency. It's not defined by itself, it's defined by the other, which actually is a philosophical phrase, the other. It's good to remember that one, because it can be used in many different contexts, but the other is the defining measure. You could call it the ruler, like a ruler, not a ruler like this, but a ruler you measure with. It's the measurement for what is sacred, and without the unsacred you don't have the sacred. So you let in the devil in a sort. And that is something, when I thought about it, something that is coming back in so many different contexts. And this made this tip from Kalle very, very good, because I suddenly realized this is happening all over the place. And one interesting thing is actually this division, although Christianity is disappearing, this still holds. The only thing is, it's been a turn of the table once more. For today, I wouldn't like to call it religion, but the foremost ideology actually says that everything is coming from the mundane. What? How could I say that? It's lunacy. Has he lost his mind? Well, look at it this way. If you see the sacred as something is not of this world, because this is actually what it's implying. Remember the goods in the temple. What are they? Well, they are, of course, money and gold, but they are also things like silk and wool and linen. I'd guess there were even food for sale there. I think that's an educated guess. Doves even. Look at that. Doves there. And those things are also tangible. Whereas the sacred more and more gets a sort of sense of not being tangible. The soul is no longer something you can like fingertip touch. You cannot point to it in the end. You cannot say exactly where it is. It's non-material. And this is I would say, further development of this starting division, and it's that this is more material and the material is not good. That is, of course, what happened, I mentioned earlier, with the Gnostics. They thought everything material, not only jewelry and gold and richness, everything material was bad, the body especially. So, and what is what did I mean by this religion, ideology? Well, look at it this way. These days, we turn the table completely. Because this is dependent. And if this is dependent somehow, when this disappeared, we start to think that this is the only one that is remaining. And all of a sudden we do the opposite. We define everything from the mundane, the material. And this is, of course, with a crude name, materialism, but also could be called reductive materialism. And the idea of reductive materialism, I would say here, and this is the more extravagant proposition for tonight, this being a Sunday and all, I'd say that radical materialism or reductive materialism in its extreme form actually is trying to marginalize what it's not. It's not sacred. And also, this is most interesting, material we always think for some mad reason is always something you can touch. You see here, we got one of these actual things that turn up here is becoming determinative for this materialism, something you can touch. And obviously, if you know some of physics, you don't have to know all of it, but if you know some of it, you know already by Newton, it's very hard to say that the material is actually something you can touch. It doesn't really make sense, actually. But I would say that's the pervading thing. That is what people think today. It's been a turn of the table. And I think reductive materialism is actually codependent with what it is not. And it's not untangible. It's not non-localized. That's very important. It's not non-localized. Matter is always situated. You see here, the turn of the table, the Necker cube is now shifting. So this is actually a very modern thing, to say that the material things are something tangible, but also that they are localized. That becomes important, because this is not localized. The sacred is, in a way, not something you can point to. You can say that the sacred might take place within the temple, but it's not the same thing like saying it's inside the temple in that way. It's a different use of proposition and verbs. This is radically different. And sometimes I'm actually thinking about this absolute need among the radical materialist for the material to be tangible, and how it sort of shocks them. And this happened to me like 5-6 times. It's not an infrequent happening, but 5 or 6 times people have been saying, did you know that matter is mostly empty? And you're supposed to gasp at that because of this reason. This, oddly enough, explained a lot of other things I've been thinking of. Things that amazed me and I never got a clear answer for. Why does materialism need to be something you can touch? Why does it need to be localized? Why does it have to be in a specific position? And to this I can also add that the division is usually something you find in the Abrahamic religions and Zoroastrianism. But for some reason this is not existent in Eastern philosophical or religious thinking. There is no division here. There is no prioritizing of something sacred, define what it's not. Because what is sacred there is just sacred. It's not codependent. And therefore, commercial is going on within the temple. It's not something to be castigated. And there is a commercial even in the kingdom of death. Because it's quite common in China, Taiwan, Korea to give money gifts to deceased people. Money does take a great part there. Whereas in the Western country, we think that's ludicrous. You cannot bring money to you on the other side. I would say our thinking is caused by this division. This division of labor, you can call it also. One is doing one thing, it's helping to define, it's this one. And the other one could be in the light, getting all the light, being the good thing, the thing that you should want. And there is another point, often pointed out from Eastern tradition. Doesn't this, they ask, create a tension, both in maybe organization, but maybe even most in the individual? Individual, for some reason in our culture, is supposed to cast away the body and seeing it as being found of lower value and not caring about it, neglecting it. Neglect the body is good for the soul as much as you can. You should even, like the Flagellants, hit yourself with a whip or something like that. Hurt your body. Make loads of holes in it, as they do in the Philippines. Well, they're going to do it once more in Easter. Put themselves with nails and everything. I'd say that that tendency could be caused by this division of labor, actually. It could be some point that actually creates tension. And possibly, this is just a suggestion, it's not something I want to say, but I could actually in some way even further the division, taking us away both from the sacred and the mundane at the same time. And it doesn't get any better if you turn the table, because all these radical and reductive imperialists, that's not the right word, the radical materialists, they strand with problems. They cannot explain anything about this. So how do you solve it? Well, it's going to be the nutcase solution. You're going to say something that's so ludicrous nobody in the earth can believe it. For instance, you say the non-material doesn't exist at all, and I don't exist either. Something like that, which is complete nuts. But this is holding on to this, and maybe those people feel if I allow something that's non-material and non-tangible and non-localized to enter into the world, this is going to destroy everything. So I really need to clean my own house and get rid of anything it isn't anything. And who does this sound like? Well, it sounds like Parmenides, of course. Everything is completely dense. There's not an inkling of emptiness anywhere. It's like being in a black hole. And of course, this division, I would say, has something, and I'm not going to dwell too much on it, because there is an interesting thing here that actually is attached to attention. Attention for us usually involves blocking out things. We're going to concentrate on one subject. We're going to separate it. We're going to dissect it, take it apart. And of course, that's one way of doing it, but for some reason in the West, this has been the prioritized way of doing it. And the other one, less, not as qualitative. And over again during the years, I heard this phrase. It's not true. Quantitative is not better than qualitative. That goes with all research. As a young researcher usually elects to 90% quantitative or qualitative. But it's very hard really to learn anything from quantitative, because you need the qualitative aspect. Things do not count themselves. They need to have character. And this is one of the problems with this idea of the mundane as well, because it's the same idea, it's the Necker cube. It's just that it turns from one to the other and to the other to the one. And although it does have its sort of advantages, it sort of undermines its own foundations all the time. It's a little bit like you have a discussion. What will happen in a discussion? Well, very often what happens is you get some sort of polarization, especially if you don't agree with each other. And if I start to talk to somebody who doesn't agree with me, I am bound to get more into my views and starting to define myself in contradistinction to the other person. And what do we have here? We had nothing but the very start of Western philosophy in a way. Most interesting, because we define truth as a battle between two people. And whatever happens in that battle, the outcome, this is the thing we should do. We should let truth be the battle between two people, maybe at best 3 people or 4 people, something like that. And that should be truth henceforth. It is really weak. It's the weakest definition of truth there can be actually. And I don't know what it makes it most weak. One thing is happening now, doesn't tell me anything about truth tomorrow or truth yesterday. And the second thing, it's a truth that is very dependent on personal opinion. It's dependent on the personality of the people being in the combat. And it also excludes the rest of humanity. So this, I'd say, it's a codependency in 3 levels. But you see here how it works. First you isolate 2 views from each other. The other one is just looking at it passively, theory, as we know, theater. In the play, 2 combatants fight over what is true. And the one who wins is going to be prioritized, and the other one is going to be marginalized, getting second place, and also despised. Because that person is holding something bad in his hand. Second place is something to be despised. And at the same time, they sort of get more and more codependent for their existence. Here you have a stain. Stain is dependent of a peiron. A peiron is something that is castigated. A peiron seems to be this undefined no thing that we don't like. Castigate that and we get loads of a stain. I don't know, it's a little bit, if you don't have any food and you start eating off your own joints, your own limbs, it won't work in the end, because every time you define, you're going to make this one smaller and smaller, because it has to be divided, and then divided, and then divided, and then divided, and then divided. Because at every time you do that, you get a new polarization. It's just like a magnet. You get a new south pole, you get a new north pole, and you continue, dividing and dividing. And I think we are in the middle of this dividing process. So this was my take on deconstructing the sacred and the commercial. And I think around about that, maybe we should zoom on the Necker cube and see if the audience can see it change in front of their eyes. It is pure magic. And realize it's very hard to stick to all one day. Okay, I say good evening and thank you very much for today. Bye bye.
Thank you.